talking about a little bit about what these people did, and then how maybe we could do some of this as well. These are all people who have doctorates, who at one point were traditional academics, teaching at universities. And I'm sure we can identify a few of these people, right? Upper left-hand corner is Dr. Ruth, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, okay, who has a doctorate in education, and started teaching there, at Columbia Teachers College. Below her is
That's the signed Neil.
That's Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil
He's the only one I know.
The scientist.
The astrophysicist, but he, from Cosmos, and actually his work has been pretty much all public facing recently, being the director of the Museum of Natural History, their space department, for the last decade or so. The other, in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Paul Krugman, who you might know as a New York Times columnist, but he's an economist, PhD, taught at Princeton and at Baruch. In the upper right-hand corner, that's Adam Grant, a psychologist from University of Pennsylvania, and he's written many books, and he has a New York Times occasional column.
So they are not still with the universities, Scott? They don't hold their academic positions anymore?
Well, many of them still do, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Adam Grant does, and Jonathan Chait, who's there in the or Jonathan Haidt, I'm sorry, in the middle there, he's the famous, like, the different aspects of morality, and he's a psychologist. I forget exactly where, but Dr. has retired. Neil deGrasse Tyson is not affiliated with the university, but with the museum. And Paul Krugman does still occasionally teach, and he's a professor emeritus at Princeton. Anyway, the point here is, they could have just been like good academics who taught their classes, who did traditional research, and could have had great, impactful, very useful careers. They chose another path to take their academic work and make it into something that directly impacted the public. And I think there's room for all of us in higher education to adapt some of this into what we do, if you're interested, or if you feel a calling to help people with the rest of the world. And I just have a couple of little headlines there, but also here's my agenda. So I want to talk about expanding the impact of research generally, and then I'm going to pull examples from my area of work-life research, and management research. And, you can see what I'm going to talk about here. Why can and should we aim for impact beyond academia? What barriers are in our way as academics? A positive example, my experience, some ideas for getting started, and an idea for how we can maybe advocate for public-facing work to be more valued in things like faculty review, and other things internal to academia. So I have a packed agenda, so I'm just going to move along. So why should we aim for this? I think the most important one is the first two bullet points, which is people need and can use good, valid information. There's a lot of people spewing information out there. Not many of them have done the research or understand the research really well. And therefore we get either people trying to sell us something, or something that has a spin to it, or questionably valid information, or we get journalists who don't really understand science, who might take one data point and make it seem like this is the end all and be all. This is why every month there's a new superfood that we all should be eating, and a new food that we've been eating that we should never eat anymore. Right? It'd be better if we got good information, right? So, and in my case, I really, and there's much more movement in the work, family, and work-life scholarship community that not just other academics and not just our students, but working parents, managers, leaders, human resources professionals, advocacy groups, public policy makers, all need really good information. And it has been very true that many state legislatures have been very moved by great research done by work-life scholars on the importance of parental leave and other supports, and that has built into public policy. From a personal point of view, you can build your reputation, and then that provides some opportunities for you outside of traditional academia, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I find it very fulfilling to do public-facing work. because you can really have a direct impact. You can see that impact much more quickly. Janessa's article based on your dissertation is going to take, 18 months to get published or something, like even after it's accepted. It's nice to have a more immediate impact that you can have in other outlets. It's also fun to write in a variety of publications beyond podcasts, etc. Students, peers, deans really like seeing public-facing work. They don't value it, but they like it, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the barriers that are in our way, many of us are not trained in this. We haven't built the skills in this. Some universities provide media training now for a lot of their professors. And if yours does, I would recommend that to build some of those skills. How we are trained to write, and this directly relates to Janessa's point of view. Academic writing, right, takes out the creativity and the humanity out of our writing, and we write in these very stilted, kind of formal, boring ways, right? And that's what we learn as a skill. And writing for other audiences requires different skills. It could be outside our comfort zones. Many academics are introverted and really love to spend time with the data as opposed to out in the world. We also are busy. We have a full-time job. We have families and other commitments. And then academia doesn't really reward this work. And again, I've said it twice, but I'm going to dive into it a little bit later on. So one of my favorite examples here, I was giving a talk about this topic actually at a Work Family Researchers Network conference. And I was like, this was my favorite thing of the year. I saw that Dr. Kate Weishar, who I did not know at the time, she was in the audience for my talk. And she didn't know I was talking about her, or was planning to talk about her, so she was like really happy. Anyway, she did this fantastic research study to show how at-home moms face so many barriers when they're trying to rejoin the workforce. And it's one of those studies where, they make these fake resumes and they send them out under different situations. And it turns out women who, it was clear that they got fired from their last job, fared better than women who, stepped away to raise kids until they went to school and then wanted to rejoin the workforce. And there was a huge bias against kind of these returning parents who stepped out of the workforce for parenting reasons. It was published in American Sociological Review, mainstream of sociological research. And later won awards from the American Psychological Association and the Work Family Researchers Network Conference because it was an amazing study. But I didn't read the study. I don't read American Sociological Review. I'm in the business school. But it was repurposed for an HBR online article that in 850 words kind of explains what the research study showed and its impact and what, in this case, managers and hiring managers, how they should use this information. I read that HBR article. And then I went back and I read the American Sociological Review article, and I'm like, this is amazing. But I wouldn't have seen the American Sociological Review article. There was dozens of media hits because this, obviously, you could see why this would be something that would be of media interest. She was interviewed for tons of other publications, newspapers across the country, national websites, etc. And, the fact is her research had greater impact because it wasn't just in an sociological journal. It was in all these other areas and it had huge impact. And she didn't have to do that much more to help make that happen. So that's why I love this example, because she doesn't do a ton of public facing stuff, but she does this extra push when her research goes out. I've done a little bit more. So in my experience, I was having what I called a mid-career crisis right after I got promoted to full professor. And I started thinking, who needs good information on work life? And, it's working parents and it's employers in my case. And so I started writing for them. I started a blog back in 2012 to help fathers specifically with work-life balance issues. That led to, I also started writing for practitioner-oriented articles, harvardbusinessreview.org, Wall Street Journal. You can see that in the top left corner, Time Magazine, many other outlets. It led to my first book, which was specifically for working dads. I then shifted, and my more recent book is the one in the middle there called The Whole Person Workplace, and from the employer point of view. And, this has been something I've really enjoyed. It's incredibly fulfilling, but it also led to, again, starting by just trying to get some ideas out there with a blog. And again, blogs are dead. You have to do something different now. But It led to books. It led to speaking opportunities. It led to advocacy opportunities. I worked with the states of New York, New Jersey on their parental leave policies and getting it passed in New York. I spoke at the White House and the United Nations on these issues. I do corporate talks. I've been on, CNN and MSNBC. I did 18 months of just-in-time training at Microsoft for expectant dads about what their parental leave experience would be and how they could make the most of it for not just for them, but for their work groups. And, it just has provided a ton of opportunities just from a self-interested point of view. But what I'm most proud of here is that I've been able to provide just-in-time information to lots of people who could use good information on work-life balance, both working parents, especially dads, and employers and HR people through my work. And that's been my experience doing it. And I'm sorry if that sounded braggy. I don't mean it to, but that's what I've been doing for a while now. And it's been great. And I've been loved doing every minute of it. The thing is, it does sometimes feel like I have two jobs. So I'll get to that in a little bit. So some ideas, if you wanted to get started, kind of writing for a larger audience or trying to have impact beyond traditional academic venues, is first off, your university PR department could be very helpful here. They likely have relationships with local media, and local media needs people to quote for articles, or they need someone to interview, or maybe they need guest writers or op-eds and things like that. And so that's one way to get started. Also, these PR departments often provide training for either speaking or for writing in a more human way as opposed to an academic way. Local media. So you don't have to start trying to get into the Wall Street Journal. You could start, with whatever local newspaper you have in your area. There are academic practitioner peer-reviewed journal articles, peer-reviewed journals. One that I have written in is called the Journal of Total Rewards. We cite data. It includes, studies with data. It includes citations and peer review, but it's written for an audience that is a combination of kind of practically oriented academics and practitioners in the fields of compensation and benefits. There are academic practitioner journals in everything. I'm sure in education, there are journals that hit for those. Network. I had a friend of a friend who wrote something for HBR.org. I talked to my friend. She introduced me to this friend of a friend. This friend of a friend introduced me to an editor at Harvard Business Review. And my first piece I wrote for Harvard Business Review was something that got to skip the lines right to the editor. Not that it got in necessarily because of that, but it enabled me to get it in front of the editor instead of all the other gatekeepers that sometimes come before that. I would also say we need to practice writing like a journalist. And you could do this in a lot of different ways, Medium or social media, LinkedIn newsletters. That's what I'm doing now to get some of my work out. These are ways that we could just, try to write in a way that, like, the thesis statements in the beginning. Why is this important is in the beginning, not at the ends, right? If you think about a traditional research study, right? The important, like, we hide, like, what is the implication of this work? Well, it's at the last page. Like, that's not how anyone else writes except for academics. So we need to just train ourselves. I've been complimented in my books, and again, I don't want to sound braggy here, that I write very conversationally. Like, it's almost like a one-to-one, like a friends talking, or maybe a friendly coworker talking to another friendly coworker, and that's an intentional choice. But I had to develop that voice in my writing, and I did that through the blog, through several years of writing twice a week, and just trying to write it conversationally and trying different things to see what worked for me and my voice. There's also a couple of other organizations that could be helpful. There's HARO, which is Help a Reporter Out. You could sign up for this, and reporters who need quotes from people will send out, like, hey, I need a business quote here, an education quote here. I need someone who knows something about marketing fitness equipment to comment on this for an article I'm writing. So that could be a way to get started. And then there's the op-ed project, which specifically is there to help academics learn how to write op-ed pieces for newspapers and magazines and things like that. So these are ways one can get started. If you're considering more public-facing work, you have to consider what your goals are, what you're comfortable with, and it's totally okay if it's not for you. What kind of support do you have? Where are you in your career? This is much easier to do post-tenure than pre-tenure, I think, which is a shame. And then what skills do you need to build? Some of us are already really good speakers or really good writers, but maybe we need to build on some other skills that we might have. I'm happy to talk to any of you if you'd like to, get my perspective on some of these issues. But finally, how do we advocate for this within academia? Well, colleges love it when professors do these things, but they don't formally support it usually. Faculty review, for annual review, tenure, promotion, internal grants, release time are all really heavily based on peer-reviewed journal articles. But I feel like we need to keep making the case, and I've been banging my head against the wall for like 10 years trying to make a case for this. So I have not been super successful on this, but I feel like more of us need to make some internal advocacy for impactful, non-purely academic work. I make the case when I can, but it's sometimes hard to do that if I'm a lone voice. But maybe if a group of faculty at a school or a department feel this way, they can have a stronger voice. One idea I have is there is a service called Altmetric that I know a few business schools have signed subscriptions for. And what this does, instead of just finding like citations of articles, this scrubs the web for where is your research been cited on websites or in articles or on social media, and it creates kind of counts on that. And this could be something that like gives the review body something qualitative to look at, and could be like a metric that could be incorporated perhaps in in review processes and things like that. So that's just one idea. I honestly wish I had more, and I would love it if any of you had ideas there too. So anyway, that's just my talk a little bit about how academics, I think, can, and there's a real need to get better information out there, and then maybe how you can get started with some of this type of work. So thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you, Scott. I mean, something that when I've read your first book, that was my immediate reaction. Like, how can you write? Because anything that I write it looks academic. My wife complains about me talking to her too like a professor. She's like, don't talk to me like a professor. It's just, and I didn't go to school in this country too. So it's just one of those things really, really hard for me to develop. I admire your work and I'm like, low-key jealous, but at the same time, I'm like, how can I develop these skills? It's just requires maybe too much time to maybe.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I most attributed this to is I did write this blog for 5 years pretty intently, and then kind of hung on for about 2 years before I ended it. And that and I did this specifically. So he's kind of crazy now, but Scott Adams, who is the creator of the Dilbert comic strip, I don't know if you thought, okay, but he had some really good advice about writing because he was an engineer, right? Mm-hmm. And he just said, he started blogging like not long after Dilbert kind of gained traction. And he said, I just write different kind of voice, different thing, trying different styles, trying different hats on. And you can see in a blog what gets read a little more than what gets shared a little more, what gets comments more than others. So, I wound up writing about probably 1,500, 1,600 words a week on like advice and encouragement for dads trying to balance work and family. And, I'm no expert in that, right? I mean, I am a little bit because I do work life research, but I'm also was a dad, like figuring this stuff out at the same time. So I think maybe that informed it, that the voice that worked really well is like, hey, I'm a dad. I happen to know a little bit more like in this academic work, but I'm still trying to figure it out too, man. So it's like, if you were sitting down with a friend of yours who had kids around the same age, how would you want to be talked to, right? And that kind of informs, I think, some of my writings. But thank you for that, Omar. I really appreciate you saying that.
If you have time for questions, I have one question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And maybe you mentioned that, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but I think in a typical academics career, your priorities are pretty much set, like publish in top journals and then get promoted and stuff like that. So did you have that vision in your mind and you just jumped at it when you had the opportunities, or did you have to wait until the right time?
I did wait. I called it my quote unquote mid-career crisis. I was I was already tenured. I actually went up for full kind of early in my life. And I was like, okay, well, just checking the box. I never loved the whole like just checking the box thing. I always felt a little hemmed in by just writing academic research articles like we tend to write. I did it. I wrote in good journals.
Articles that 38 people read, so that's...
I'm sorry?
Like 38 people read, like academic articles, it's just the audiences.
Impact, right? But also just the confines of how one writes, I found stifling a little bit. So I think I was always brewing in me. I did what I needed to do to, be a really good teacher, to be a good enough scholar, to have impact for my students. It helps a little bit that I'm in a business school and we have a little more kind of correspondence with an outside constituency. So I always had a little bit of doing workshops or a little bit of consulting on the side, and maybe that helps a little bit to spur this along. But you're right. I did have to. I waited till it was a little easier where the pressure to publish in traditional senses was less in order to do this, because unfortunately right now it's kind of an ands until you get to the point where you're Adam Grant, right? Or one of those other people that I put in the beginning of the presentation.
Did you ever read, I think it's called From the Ivory Tower to the Schoolhouse?
I have not read it, but I've heard of this book, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about that. As a teacher, I'm
Sure.
debating, do I leave teaching and become a professor where I get roped into this really tight that I have to do these things, or can I be more powerful where I am? And so, yeah, I really enjoyed your talk because it really helped me see like there are other ways maybe to
thank you
to spread what I know,
Yeah, I guess thank you, Jessa, and also Selcook, back to your question, we teach in classrooms, right? So we actually communicate in a much different way, right? In a more direct way, in a more active voice way, in a way that I hope, I'm sure we do, because I trust we care about our jobs as teachers, that we communicate in the way that can be best understood by our audience, right? Whether that's undergrad, graduate, etc. And that's really that's the fundamental skill here, is communicating in the way that the audience wants. And I guess what gets back to Janessa too, right? Like, an academic essay, you presented what they want. A creative essay, you give what they want. My son's college application essays are way more creative than what he wrote for that exam. For example, he wants to go to film school. So that creativity is something that they're going to look for, right? If he were, just going to be a math major or something, we'd make sure the essays were a little more, So you always calibrate what you write or what you say to who you're communicating with, right? So that's the fundamental skill.
So the funny thing is, I was chatting with Janessa privately when you were presenting. I was like, I was feeling a little guilty because I was suggesting her in the process to write in a less personal way because this is academic writing, and she has a style, and that style comes naturally. And academic writing isn't like that, and it has lots of restrictions. And in our field too, there are some academics who really understand the science of something, a field, but also they are good at communicating the same science to the
well maybe the compromise is, give to the academic journal what the academic journal wants. Is there a way to turn this into something that like something that teachers read? A professional organization of teachers might want some sort of, not simplified, but a translation of what the research was into something that's practical. That might be something one can do.
Yeah,
and that's
yes, she's doing a quantitative research with a quantitative professor. So I think that's what's going on here.
Yes, enough. That's a good point too. All right. Thank you.